Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Tobi Knaup, CEO and co-founder of D2iQ, which provides the leading independent Kubernetes platform, which simplifies and automates the really difficult tasks needed for enterprise-grade production at scale while reducing operational burden and reducing costs. Tobi, as I mentioned before, I'm so excited to chat with you and learn more about your background, your experience, the growth of Mesosphere to D2, and really, for the founders out there, how to navigate a transition, how to grow at scale, and the different mechanics behind, being successful and growing as a successful company. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started, Mesosphere, but now D2iQ?
Yeah. So right before starting the company, I was an engineer at Airbnb. I was one of the first engineers that actually joined the company when the founders were still running it out of their apartment in San Francisco. So it was quite the experience to see the company grow from, less than 20 people to what it is today. And, did a lot of different things there as one of the first engineers, wore many hats. I worked for another startup before Airbnb that was even smaller. And, but my experience with cloud and infrastructure and machine learning software actually goes back to when I was a teenager, because I grew up in Germany. My best friend and I actually started a company when we were 15 years old and helped people, design websites and host servers and things like that.
Yeah. What do you think about the advent of all the new kind of like built ready, like no code platforms and things like that? How much different would your company be at 15 now with all the recent tools and platforms out there?
Oh, very different. I mean, we had to build everything from scratch back then. It was quite fascinating, but I think it gave me like a really broad view on, what it takes to build online. So we literally built our own servers. We would like order parts on the internet and assemble our own servers and then, ask our parents to drive us to the data center so we could rack the server and connect it. We figured out how to, run Linux-based servers, the Apache web server and other things like that. Learned PHP. We programmed our own e-commerce solution. Like everything was built from scratch. And, today, I mean, you can build an e-commerce site in probably a few hours by just clicking a few buttons, basically. So it's very different.
What was the initial antithesis to go from Germany and come to the States? And was that your first engineering like professional job when you jumped into, was it Pinksta at the time?
Right.
And then obviously moving to Airbnb. What was that transition like, going from one location to a completely different one? And then also being at the beginning of your professional.
It was quite exciting. So, growing up in Germany, outside of Silicon Valley, very far from Silicon Valley, right? You hear all these stories about startups and companies that are being founded there. And so I always thought, like, I got to check this place out. I want to see what it's like. And so in college, I just tried to find an internship somewhere in the Valley. And, I applied at all the big companies like Google and Apple and so forth, and never heard back. But that didn't discourage me. So I just tried, other places. And then one day I saw an email on Ruby on Rails mailing list. I was doing a lot of Rails at the time, and I was from this startup called Pinksta, and they were looking for interns. So I was like, oh, great. I'll talk to those guys. And, they offered me an internship, a college internship. So I worked with them for, 3 or 4 months back in 2008. And that was my first taste of, the startup world. And it was super exciting. I just loved the energy that everybody had. And I, went to a few meetups locally to meet some other, engineers and people that were building companies. And the energy was just so infectious. And then, Pinksta, that startup, the founder and CEO actually wanted to convince me to stay on and not finish my degree. I'm like, I think I'll finish that first.
Good idea.
But I came back a year later to join them full time in 2009.
Yeah. Well, being a part of the startup culture so early, what do you think, I guess benefited you now not now, but when you started your own company, that you carried on in terms of the lessons or the structure? Was it the culture? Was it the ethos? I think a lot of people kind of try to balance out, do I go into this avenue of my career? I guess for the non-founders and the audiences, do I go and work for a larger company, work for a startup? I guess what were the benefits that you feel carried over to building your own company?
Yeah, many lessons. And I learned some of those lessons, like I said, early on as a teenager. It was always really fun for me to just create something out of nothing. I think that's probably the most, just invigorating thing about building a company is like you start with nothing and you're building something. But also, when we started this first company as teenagers, we learned some hard lessons too, right? We had customers who didn't pay their bills. And so you're like, well, what do we do now? And things like that. So, and then just also realized how much work it is, right? Because I think if you're an employee, you have your job, you work a certain amount of hours, but, for us, even back then, we were in school, of course. So there was school. And then, on the afternoons and evenings, we would, write code and design websites.
Yeah.
And then on weekends, we would send invoices to our clients, right? So you just got an early idea of how much work it is. And then, just joining Airbnb in the early days too. And Pinkster was an early stage startup too. A lot of things go wrong. It's not a straight line to the top, even for a hugely successful company like Airbnb. So, just a lot of experiences there too. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah. If you were to think back in, I guess in 2013, when you first started Mesosphere at the time, which, if I remember, that's what it was first called. What was the inspiration behind leaving Airbnb and really taking on, Mesosphere on its own project? Was it, was the problem so compelling that you had to follow it? Or was it, the inkling of having this continued entrepreneurial mindset that you were like, yeah, I see a problem and I have to go. Which one was it? Was it problem guided? Was it a little bit of mixture in terms of yourself, or for other founders that are maybe in a similar experience?
Yeah, totally. So it was a little bit of both. So I, moved to Silicon Valley actually around the same time as my best friend. So the guy I founded the company with when we were 15, we grew up in the same town in Germany, but we both moved to the States and ended up in San Francisco around the same time. He was working for Twitter at the time, and he ended up being my co-founder at Mesosphere too. And there's a third guy too, Ben, who, so Flo is my best friend. Ben is the third founder. And Flo and Ben met during a student exchange in high school. So, and Ben also came to the Bay Area around the same time. He was, doing some research work in Berkeley, basically working on his PhD on, container orchestration software. He created Apache Mesos, one of the, first open source container softwares. And so, Flo and Ben worked at Twitter. I worked at Airbnb, and, these companies were growing super fast and had scaling challenges. And between the three of us, right, we solved a lot of these scaling challenges using containers. So both Twitter and Airbnb were early adopters of Linux containers and Apache Mesos, right, which Ben had created. And so, is sort of twofold. So the selfish reason, I say for starting this company was that I used to be the guy with the pager, and sometimes the pager, goes off at 3 a.m. and then you spend 5 hours fixing broken computers, right? Nobody likes to do that. And then, we automated a lot of the operations, right? We implemented container orchestration. So a lot of these problems went away, and basically the system could just fix itself a lot of the time, right? When something randomly crashed, ran out of memory, whatever it was. So selfishly, my pager didn't go off as much anymore. So I'm like, well, this is great. This is like a mythical 10x technology, right? That solves all my problems. But on a more serious note, we were doing a lot of open source meetups at the time around Mesos and talking about how we solved these scaling challenges at Twitter and Airbnb. And a lot of interesting companies started showing up to the meetups and said, we have similar problems and that we knew how to solve in a much better way. And so that's where we saw a big opportunity to really say like, okay, eventually every company is going to run into scaling challenges like this. This was around a time where Mark Andreessen's article in the Wall Street Journal had just landed, which he called Software is Eating the World. Netflix was just starting their streaming business a few years earlier and, eating in the blockbuster. And so we thought, eventually every company is going to have to run online services and keep them available and scalable. And, we know how to help them. So that's why we created the company. I think the other aspect was just, Flo and I had started a company before in Germany. It was a lot of fun overall.
Yeah.
And so, at some point over drinks, in San Francisco, we realized like, hey, we're in Silicon Valley now. Everyone's starting companies. We got to start a company too one day. And so we were basically just waiting for the right idea. And Mesosphere and container orchestration was it.
Yeah. Describe a little bit about, you said a lot of companies face scaling problems, and without the container service, they're not able to mitigate these problems either quickly or that, they're not able to overcome them, almost entirely, it seems like, if they don't have some sort of solution built in long term. So what does that trickle down in terms of other problems that companies start seeing? Obviously, there's this one, kind of a lesion, right? But then I'm assuming it kind of leads into other things.
Yeah. So I think, what it comes down to is just, companies being able to offer online services that are resilient, that are secure, and that they can operate effectively. So, again, when we were teenagers and we were running this company, there wasn't much automation, right? If we wanted automation, we had to build it ourselves, and we would just write a bunch of bash scripts to do things. And, even early Twitter and Airbnb days, it was kind of still like that, right? A lot of home built, and just a lot of manual effort. And those of you who remember who were maybe Twitter users back in 2009, 2010, you would see the fail whale a lot. So the fail whale, this cartoon whale, when Twitter was over capacity. Well, the reason was that how the infrastructure was originally built wasn't very scalable. And so, as Twitter became more popular, the infrastructure just couldn't keep up. And I think one thing that changed at the time too is, well, in the early days of the internet, the internet was kind of like a playground, people hung out there, whatever. But slowly over time, online services became a bigger part of people's lives, and they became bigger, more important revenue streams for companies, right? In the early days of Twitter, they weren't selling ads, they weren't making money. It was just, people just hung out, and maybe the fail whale was like funny and fine sometimes, but they were developing into more serious business, right? And so the service had to be resilient. It couldn't go down. And of course it had to be secure too. People try to like break into it. And similar to Airbnb, right? In the early days, small scale, but the thing took off. And so, if the site was down for a minute, that meant, a big loss for the business and unhappy customers. So like, that's sort of the realm of problems we were attacking. Is like, how do we make this thing more resilient for users? How do we make it secure so people can't break in? And then also, how do we operate it efficiently, right? Like, because obviously as you scale, especially as a venture funded company, at some point, efficiency becomes a real challenge too.
Yeah. If you don't mind describing briefly, what are the mechanics behind this container service that allows companies to, run very large applications that have a lot of users at scale without having to deal with, crashes and things that would be detrimental to a continued, say, quality service to their customers?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different technologies at play here. And, it starts with containers. So I mentioned containers a bunch. A Linux container is what we're talking about specifically. Linux containers, it's essentially a set of technologies in Linux that allow you to, package applications and then run multiple different applications on shared infrastructure. So on the same machines, running multiple different applications in parallel next to each other, sharing the resources, right? So that's just containers. So you package an application, you manage the resource sharing between them. And then you layer on top of that, you layer container orchestration. Kubernetes is the technology that most people use there. Our products that we sell as a company, D2iQ, are based on Kubernetes. So that's essentially a system which then, orchestrates, manages these containers across a lot of different machines. And so what that allows you to do then is just automate many of the aspects of running a large online service, or even a small online service, frankly, right? So if you're a developer and you're building an application, you want to ship it. Now, all you have to do is you put it in a container and you write a manifest that describes how to run this thing. And then the system will take care of everything else. It can automatically scale it up and scale it down, restart it if it crashes, and so forth. And those are all things we had to do manually in the old days.
That must have been such a time, just waking up at 3 a.m. and then working on something for 5 hours to fix, and then having that time back to you. I can imagine how much freedom you probably felt in that moment.
Right. Especially if you just had a night out with your friends and come home and your pager goes off. That's not fun.
I guess, thinking about not even just the early days, but you're going through pretty much this user discovery process with these meetups that you were having, and then figuring out the validity to your idea, and then kind of expanding on that, starting the company, is in terms of things that you had to learn new in terms of like fundraising, and you've gone through a few fundraising now, and congrats on the success with that. But
thank you.
Describe learning that skill. And if for other founders out there, what was strategically successful for you, and what are some things that weren't as successful going through the fundraising process? If you were to give a few, I guess, pieces of advice for other founders out there to continue their funding rounds, and what are the different, I guess, steps, when you're going and growing each round?
Yeah. So there's a lot to talk about there. We could probably do like a few podcast episodes on just that, just fundraising. I think we were super happy with how our fundraisings went. I think, one quote that I remember, one piece of advice I got from people is, if this is your first time you're raising money, the quote was like, you're playing a game. It's their game. You don't know the rules to the game, right? So I think get all the advice you can get. Yeah. It's complex, right? There's a lot of things and people will throw all these terms at you that you don't understand. So get a good advisor. In our case, what really helped is, a few things. So the former VP of engineering at Twitter at the time, he had left Twitter to become a VC at Planet Perkins. And so, Flo and Ben, since they worked at Twitter, it was their former boss basically. And, he was one of the first people we talked to pitch the idea. And of course he was familiar with, the success that the technology had at Twitter. So that really helped. And then, he was a good advisor to like really help us with our pitch and, tell the story. And the other thing that really helped us too, actually, it more the mechanics of fundraising, like, what's a good term sheet, what's a bad term sheet, is we just had a good lawyer that was also recommended to us. Get a good law firm, a lawyer you trust. And I think, for us, it was, I think when you're fundraising, you're selling, you're a salesperson and you're selling your idea to investors, right? So keep that in mind. And, the way to sell something really well is to tell a good story, right? Like humans, we respond to stories. So, even if you're doing something like super sophisticated technically and, and you get excited about that as a technical founder, I'm a technical founder, I get it. VC will get a little less excited about, the technical details, but if you tell a good story, that resonates with anybody. And so I think in our case, that was really important, is to hone in on that story. And then it's also, VC is also, or raising capital is also about networking. So just try to find people who can help you, who can make introductions for you to investors, who can coach you. In our case, we ended up raising money from Andreessen Horowitz for a seed round in our Series A. They're a big investor in Airbnb too. So having that connection, they did reference calls with people at Airbnb who said good things about us, I imagine. So those things help.
Do you have any favorite, just, I guess, a little piece of selfish advice, but do you have any favorite templates that you use to like gather those reference calls or get introductions for those reference calls? Is there anything that you saw that you thought that was successful that you were using in terms of wording or phrasing or way to navigate those network? I think a lot of us struggle, like, all right, I have a friend that knows somebody and then that person knows somebody, but how do I make the connection? And I get, not elegantly, but enough to where it's extremely authentic and genuine to get the response that you want.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it comes down to the story too, right?
Yeah.
It's so getting that right. I mean, in terms of, a template or like, how do you ask? I think, generally I like to keep emails as short as possible. And I prefer phone calls a lot of times, just talk to people and tell your story. And it's gotta be something, if you have an exciting story to tell, then, people will be excited to bring that story to like break the news, so to speak, to an investor they might know or someone else they might know, right? I think that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, amazing. Describe, mesosphere or mesos, I heard you call it short for mesos. Describe the transition to adding more features, adding more products, and then going through a rebrand and creating a D2iQ, which I learned stands for day two, some DevOps term, which I'd love to hear the description from that. But describe, I think a lot of companies, we work on one really good product and then we're starting to build momentum and traction. Then at some point we're getting requests for other things, or we see other things in the market that we can impact positively with a solution or a piece of technology. But it's hard to define when the right time is to incorporate that and how that might take away from visions. Some of the times, companies do a rebrand to incorporate all the solutions that they have. What was the process like, the thoughts that went into making a critical rebrand and the decision and incorporating all that? And how did you maintain the core value of the product that you originally created?
Yeah. So I think our story is a bit unique there. So our company used to be called Mesosphere because the core open source technology that our original product was built around is called Apache Mesos. So it's an Apache project, which my co-founder Ben created at Berkeley, originally as a research project, but then it became the basis for Twitter production. And open source container orchestration software, we created the company around it and basically productized this open source software to make it usable for, any mainstream enterprise. And, what happened, and we had a great story there, right? It was like, this is the stuff that powers Twitter and Airbnb. But then a few years later, Google came out with their own, similar software called Kubernetes. And they told the world, this is like how we run Google internally, right? It's based on our best ideas for how we operate Google. And, now it's open source and you can use it too. And so basically what happened, what's really critical in open source is to build a strong and healthy community, right? Where ideally there are actually many different companies and perspectives represented in the community. It's never good if it's just owned by a single company, even, if it's your company, you created the thing, you can make the pie a lot bigger by creating a bigger community. And so, what happened over the years is that it's just a really big community formed around Kubernetes. A lot of people went there, including people from our community, from the Mesos community, just went there and, it was just sort of had this really galvanizing effect. And so, basically that's where the action was. And so for us as a company, in our sales conversations, talking to prospects, for a very long time, because it takes time for this kind of software to mature and measured in years. For a long time, we could point out, clear technical advantages, right? Mesos is more scalable, it's more robust, it's more proven. But there just came a point where prospects said like, well, I get it, but this is where the action is, right? That's the community I want to join, that, I want to be able to recruit people from that community or whatever the reason was. And so it became obvious to us at some point that we're going to have to reorient the business around it. We actually got involved in Kubernetes right from the beginning. We partnered with Google. We co-founded the Cloud Native Computing Foundation with Google and others because we knew it was going to be big. And so, at some point we tried to like offer 2 product lines in parallel for some time. It very quickly became obvious that we need to focus. And so we decided to go all in. We built a completely new product line from scratch, built on Kubernetes. And in that process also renamed the company because, we had Mesos, the name of the technology, in our company name. And, we just wanted to make sure there's no confusion that we're doing something else now. So, little word of advice for other founders out there, don't put the technology name in your company name.
That's a good piece of advice. What was it like in terms of the educational part with kind of obviously new name, new pretty much platform based on new technology? Did you have any drop off from customers that you had or how did you kind of mitigate that with education, or was it active conversations, for founders going through maybe a similar transition? How can they, de-risk themselves from either losing any traction that they have?
Yeah. Lots of conversations is the bottom line. Yeah. We stayed, really close to our customers. There was a group of customers. So we always do, customer advisory boards on a regular basis where we get feedback from customers. So this was one of those things too, where we told a, group of our most trusted customers that we're planning to do this. So they got their feedback and advice. And so, I think with a big transition like this, and, for our customers, this was a lot of work, right? It was obviously a big transition for us as a company, but for our customers too, they had to, relearn everything and rebuild their infrastructure. So massive migration. And so basically we just tried to make it as easy as possible for customers to say yes to migrating to the new product. Yeah. So we built migration tools, we did favorable pricing, we did free or discounted professional services where our team, our field engineering team would actually partner with the customers to help them migrate. So basically try to make it as easy as possible for people to say yes, even though it's something they really don't want to do. And then, what always happens with something like this is some people will say yes and some people will say no, and they'll do something else. So we actually have people that opted to still use the old product. We don't provide any support for it anymore, but they're still using it and supporting themselves. Other people went somewhere else and other people migrated. So that's pretty typical.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the traction that you're seeing now. Obviously, you've gone through a few rounds of funding. You've gone through a transition in the platform and software, and I'm assuming you continue your growth. What does the growth look like now? What are you excited about in the coming year in terms of the projections that you're expecting and team inside and things like that? Where is D2iQ headed?
Yeah, so we're very excited about, this continuing transition to the cloud and to, more digital services being created. So, as for the folks out there who have been, running stuff on the cloud or maybe have their own, cloud related startups or have been using Kubernetes or other technologies, it may seem like, this is all old stuff at this point, came out in 2015. We started our company in 2013, right? Stuff's been around for a while, but for the industry as a whole, like IT as a whole, it's such early days still. And so there's a number, I think it was actually an executive from AWS who mentioned it, that only about 10% or so of overall IT spending is on the cloud today. 90% is still off the cloud. So gives you a sense for how early it is still, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, you look at surveys around Kubernetes specifically, and, basically it's an industry standard, right? Everybody is going to move the vast majority of their workloads to Kubernetes over time. And, I think there's some really strong tailwinds that, are helping us and really anybody that's working in cloud or DevOps, which is that eventually, every company, it doesn't matter what you're selling, you're going to be building and operating some kind of cloud service, right? Whether you're selling home appliances, dishwashers, or whatever, like those things are already connected to the internet and there's a cloud app, right? Cars are connected. It's going to be, I heard recently about a company that sells power tools. So those things are getting, some IoT thing and app with it now too. So a lot of these things are still early, and obviously there's a lot of excitement around AI right now too. there's a lot of things happening in that field. And I think eventually all the industry leading products of tomorrow are going to have AI built in.
Yeah.
And AI needs a lot of resources, right? It needs a lot of compute. It needs a lot of data. And, for us as a company that provides a platform on which to run mission critical software productions, including AI, that's really exciting, right? We want to be the platform that our customers choose to build whatever is next for them, whatever their new products are. And so yeah, super excited about what's ahead there.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest risks that D2iQ faces today?
Yeah, well, like every other company out there, we look at the overall economy, right? And we wonder what's going on and, how that's going to affect things. So yeah, we don't know how the market's going to evolve over the next year. There's, different people have different opinions on it. So, for us, what that means is just be able to weather the storm, right? Be able to run the business in a way where we can see things through and manage the business in really a challenging environment. But there's also good, every crisis, or I don't want to call it a crisis, every, challenging economic environment also offers opportunity. And for us, what we're seeing with a lot of folks is that they're actually often accelerating digital projects because it helps them find new revenue streams or, be more efficient in manufacturing, for example. And so, so there's a lot of tailwinds for our business too in this environment.
Amazing. Well, if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for D2iQ?
Yeah. So, our long-term vision is we want to be the provider of intelligent infrastructure that helps customers unleash innovation, that helps them build their next generation products, that helps them, put AI into whatever products they are selling. And, a lot of our stories fall into this bucket. It's people that are building, better medical devices where they can update the software faster than ever before and use things like AI. We help companies, develop electric cars. We, long list of these things. So yeah, I think especially too, because Kubernetes and related cloud native technologies are, there's such a big lever. They really help people innovate faster and build infrastructure that's more resilient and secure and efficient. It's also pretty complicated technology, right?
Yeah.
So if you're new to it, there's a lot to learn, and it's not just Kubernetes. Kubernetes is kind of the star here, but there's over a dozen other things you need to put together. So, we really think that we're excited about what we bring to the table in terms of automating and simplifying infrastructure software. And, eventually, so I talked about AI a lot, AI and infrastructure have sort of been the two things I've been excited about for a very long time. So what we're actually going to do is, put AI into our own products to automate more things and, help more customers have that experience that I had when my pager didn't go off in the morning anymore.
I love that. I love that. The next question I love to ask for my audience and myself for research purposes, but whether it was early in your career or now, what books or people have influenced you the most?
Yeah, that's a long list. I will start with the most recent one. I recently read the book called $1 Trillion Coach.
Yeah.
It's about Bill Campbell, one of the most famous executive coaches. He coached the Google founders, coached Eric Schmidt, coached Steve Jobs, many successful executive teams across the valley. He passed away a few years ago. And so some of the coachees wrote a book about him and about his techniques, including Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, and a few others. And it's a fantastic book. It talks a lot about the human side of running a company and managing teams and culture, which, I think is the most important thing. It's probably the best piece of advice I got when I started the company, including from Brian Chesky, the Airbnb founder, which is, when you start a company, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Everybody does, but there's one mistake you should avoid at all costs, and that is don't mess up your culture.
Yeah.
So that's always been really important to me. And, that book helps with it. So yeah, that's $1 Trillion Coach. Great book. Highly recommended. Start with Why, Simon Sinek. Great book. I really like that too. High Output Management is another classic. But yeah, there's a long list.
But I definitely will tap into the $1 Trillion Coach. That sounds exciting. Anytime someone or a group of people write something about an influential figure, it's always fascinating to see the perspective change. They had one about Michael Jordan and a book written on him from a different perspective. Some of them followed him, and it was really in tune to what people probably extract from the lessons versus, the mechanics of what somebody does strategically, but it's super impactful. I've been troubleshooting this question and I'm pretty excited about it, but I'll troubleshoot on you as well. If you weren't working on this, what industry or what product or what project would you be working on if, you didn't have to, but if you weren't working on D2iQ?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So if I was working on something else, it would probably be some combination of AI and music, I think.
Yeah.
because those are my other two passions. I love music. I used to play in bands and I DJ on the side. So, and I think AI, well, music has always been very technology driven. Like every time, the electric guitar, that was a technological invention. And, all of a sudden you had rock music and then, synthesizers. And I think AI is just going to do so much for music. And I'd love to explore that space.
Yeah. It's incredible what OpenAI did with I think with Chat GPT when they came out. You can put in commands for making songs and writing lyrics and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see.
It's wild.
Yeah. Well, Tobi, so much appreciate your time. And I know we're at the top of the episode. We went over a little bit, but we could talk, I'm sure, for hours on different subjects, but such a pleasure chatting with you. Last little bit, I'd like to give my guests a chance to give us your plugs. Where can we find D2iQ? Where can we find you? Where can we be part of the mission and support the overall technology? Or if we're a customer, where can we find you and get involved?
Yeah, so you can find us at d2iq.com. So that's iq.com. And by the way, I didn't talk about this earlier, but day two, you asked about day two, the DevOps concept. So day two operations, there's day zero, which is essentially your planning phase. Day one is installation. Day two is the ongoing maintenance. So, we help people operate mission critical environments. So that's where the day two comes from. And then the IQ, we, help people become smart about the technology. And we're also putting smarts, automation, and, AI into our own products. So iq.com. You can request a demo on there to check out our software. We also have a bunch of videos on YouTube if you want to find out more about what we do. So just search for D2iQ on YouTube. And we're also pretty active on Twitter. It's also D2iQ.
Incredible. Well, I hope you enjoyed yourself, Tobi, and thank you so much again for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.